Hello and welcome to Resource Report, where we share with you important information about local nonprofits and resource organizations that support the community we share, produced by Pathways to Agency. I am your host, Michaela. Today's guests are Lynne Glore and Steffani Powell of LISO, Legal Immigration Services of Olympia, an organization that provides legal support to detainees. Lynne is the secretary of the board of directors, and Steffani is the executive director and attorney. Thanks so much for coming on board here.
Thanks for having us. My name's Lynne Glore, as Michaela just said, and I'm the secretary of the board of directors of LISO, L-I-S-O. And I came to this, I've got some background in nonprofits and was a foundation director many years ago. And when I was invited to join the board, I was happy to not hesitate for a moment. During the first Trump years, I was a part of an organization called Strengthening Sanctuary, and our focus was on supporting immigrants in the light of what was going on during those years. This seemed like a perfect transition to be a part of a startup nonprofit, and we've been in existence for almost a year now. We'll be celebrating our 1-year anniversary in July.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you.
That's an accomplishment. And Steffani, could you please introduce yourself as well?
Yes, thank you, Michaela. So my name is Steffani Powell. I've been an immigration attorney for over 30 years, but not in the context of removal or deportation work, and definitely not in the context of detained immigration removal work. I met Lynne in Strengthening Sanctuary, and when we knew we were going to start this organization, and I'll talk about the reason we started in a moment, I definitely wanted Lynne on the board with her organizational skills and fundraising skills and just her personality. We knew it would be a great match. So the reason the Legal Immigration Services of Olympia came into existence was one of my clients in my law office. Again, I focused 100% on immigration law, family-based immigration law, so working at consulates around the world, filing for deferred action for childhood arrival for students or young adults, and also U visas for victims of crime. One of my U visa recipients was out in Lacey on a Sunday morning with his wife and daughter when he was pulled over unexpectedly, and within 3 minutes taken away, leaving his wife and daughter traumatized on the side of the road. That was a Sunday. They called me. They didn't know what to do, and honestly, I didn't know what to do either. So I called some folks, met for coffee, and decided we could see the writing on the wall. We knew what was coming. If they were in Lacey arresting people who had valid claims and had filed petitions and had attorneys, then they're going to start arresting everyone. So we quickly organized, and this was our very first case. And I remember the first time I walked into the detention center saying, it looks like this is how my career is going to go from here on out, that I will be an immigration attorney working in the detained context.
You mentioned a previous organization with the name Sanctuary in it.
Strengthening Sanctuary came into being under the first Trump administration, and it really started with the city council. So the city council wanted to pass a
Sanctuary City
resolution, right, thank you. And a number of people from the community went to those city council meetings and stood up and spoke about, again, looking at the writing on the wall, listening to the rhetoric that the candidate Trump was speaking to during his campaign, and we could see that our communities were going to be devastated. So the good folks of the Olympia City Council passed a resolution. But after they passed it, one of the council members said, now let's make sure this resolution has teeth. And so we looked around, and a number of us decided to meet, and it grew from, 6, 7 people to
There were probably 40 or 50 at one time.
Folks who were there to work on making sure the resolution had teeth. And then once we started looking at what that meant, we formed subcommittees. So we had folks that were working with school systems to make sure that information was not shared with the federal government, was not taken from the families and therefore shared with the federal government. We started working with law enforcement to make sure their policies reflected the community that they served. For instance, when an individual is processed for a charge against them, their fingerprints are taken, and on the fingerprint card or in the database, it will say what country they're from. And that information is immediately shared with federal authorities, and the Olympia Police Department declined to write what country the individual was from, so that if their information is shared with federal authorities, ICE isn't looking for people from a certain country who were arrested in this jurisdiction and sending ICE officers in. So it was protecting their identities from ICE officials. We also worked with the jail, who was passing out cards to individuals that informed them of their rights not to speak to an ICE officer unless they wanted to speak to an ICE officer, because a lot of folks who were incarcerated thought they had to speak to an ICE officer if they appeared on the premises. Olympia did an amazing job kind of creating this safety net and disentangling law enforcement, local law enforcement, with federal immigration enforcement. And strengthening sanctuary was part of that conversation and that process.
Oh, wow. That sounds like so much was happening already that laid the groundwork for how your current organization is able to be so flexible. That is an incredible amount of community mobilization focused on community-specific security needs. With that said, could you please share with us the mission, vision, and goals for LISO?
I'll take a stab at the mission. LISO has a very narrowly focused mission, and that is to represent free of charge detained individuals at the detention center in Tacoma. We have learned, though, that sometimes we're representing people that get moved from Tacoma to other detention centers around the country, and that's another story that we can talk about. So the mission's very narrow, and the goal is to have enough attorneys to represent folks when we get the call.
May I just kind of piggyback on that a little bit? Is Strengthening Sanctuary also had the Know Your Rights Committee. We were conducting Know Your Rights seminars for immigrants and sometimes supporters of immigrants so that folks could avoid being detained. When we were doing that at that time, folks actually had rights, and there were removal priorities, right? At the time when we first started, it made sense to do these Know Your Rights, don't speak, don't answer any questions, don't open the door unless there's a warrant, which is still in place, don't open the door unless there's a warrant with your name on it and signed by a judicial official. But we were trying to keep people out of detention. Under the second administration, we realized it is going to be impossible to keep people out of detention. Our goals, we have now two attorneys, myself and Nina Esquivel, to the next step in creating. We just hired a bilingual caseworker part-time. We have an incredible executive assistant who really keeps the wheels on the bus, and we all say she's our boss. We work for her. She's amazing. Her name is Karen Lascaro. We have another volunteer attorney, Neil Lawrence, who has over 30 years of experience working in federal court. And so we need that experience because we're finding that the detainees or community members that are detained, it's getting more and more difficult to get them released from detentions because of the new policies, the memorandums that have come down where judges are using mandatory detention and refusing bond for individuals that normally would have been bonded out. We're having to go to federal courts to try to get the federal courts to force the immigration judges to release individuals or to give them an opportunity for bond hearings. So that Know Your Rights that we were doing with Strengthening Sanctuary was kind of setting the groundwork for the existence of LISO in the second administration of Trump.
It sounds like it got way more complicated with federal involvement that you didn't expect, so to speak. Or maybe you did expect it and it was coming down the line, but now you're having to work not just with that level of courts, but further up on those level of courts. And what would you say is the end vision for LISO, for not just potentially representation, but is there a horizon line that you guys are working towards?
It's a great question. We are so involved with our daily representation of cases and intakes. We've had 17 intakes since last week because there was a raid in Shelton. It involved a van full of women, mothers, some of them going to work, where ICE pulled over the van and arrested all the individuals in the van, leaving some children with neighbors, right? And their mother didn't come home to pick them up after work. So we have been so busy. But when I think about, and I feel like I should first vet this goal with Lynne, but the goal for LISO is we want to be out of existence because we're not needed anymore. And that is a very long-term goal, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. Because it's one of the largest detention centers, at any time there's about 1,500 people that are incarcerated there. Hearings are just going on all the time, and there's not enough judges or attorneys, but not enough judges, so they're utilizing judges from other jurisdictions. The goal is to expand the legal team so that we can stand with our community members. It is very, very difficult to go through the system without an attorney, and only 14% across the country of detained individuals have attorneys. And if you are represented, you're twice as likely to apply for and receive a benefit. So I'd like to get that number up in our own jurisdiction, that we have more than 14%, the national average of folks that are represented. We just entered into an agreement with Seattle U Law School to host externships so that law students will be working with us. And my hope is for them that when they graduate, they decide they want to be immigration attorneys working in the detention center, right? So kind of growing the base of immigration attorneys is a goal. And then someday close down these daggone detention centers, right? I have ideas. We have dreams. We want to work with the Rotary clubs across the country. If they can eradicate polio, they can close down the detention centers. So we've started a conversation with a Rotary club out of Lakewood. And I know this seems kind of pie in the sky, but I believe in it. I think we can close these down, and we can have alternatives to detention that don't require people being ripped out of their communities, away from their children, away from their employers, away from their pets and their gardens and their lives, and for no reason other than civil violations of immigration laws. So that is the goal, to close us down by closing them down eventually.
You are listening to the Resource Report on LISO, the Legal Immigration Services of Olympia, with Lynne Glore and Steffani Powell, on Chaos Radio 89.3 FM. We will be back with you after a quick break.
Todos somos dueños de nuestra cooperativa de comida en Olympia, la cual no tiene fines de lucro y se enfoca en bienes orgánicos, naturales y locales. Promoviendo la justicia social y económica, intentamos provocar efectos positivos y renovantes en la tierra y en sus habitantes. Nos ayudan más que 300 voluntarios manteniendo los productos disponibles y las cajas funcionando. Tenemos muchas oportunidades para personas de diversas habilidades y orígenes.
Puedes participar como voluntario en la cooperativa de Olympia, manteniendo nuestra comunidad fuerte al trabajar con los empleados y todos los miembros. Tu cooperativa da la bienvenida a toda la comunidad. Puedes registrarte para una orientación de voluntarios en cualquiera de nuestras tiendas. En el este, en la Avenida Pacífico número 3111, y en el oeste, en la calle Rogers, el número 921. Para más información, visita nuestra página red en olympiafood.coop.
This is Chaos, KAOS Olympia, a public service of the Evergreen State College.
Let's get back to the interview with Lynne Glore and Steffani Powell on LISO, the Legal Immigration Services of Olympia. Earlier, you mentioned a couple different statistics, like the 14%, correct me if I'm wrong, of detainees don't have representation, and then there's so many people in the detention centers at any given time. Please talk about some of the statistics that you have posted on your homepage website, because there is quite a few examples. Could you speak to those a little bit?
nationwide, there's about 14% of detained individuals that have representation. And as I said, if you have representation, you're twice as likely to request a benefit and receive a benefit. A lot of our clients are from Mexico. And just the statistics on that, I think 78% of folks detained are from Mexico, and they have one of the lowest representation rates of only 21%. If you look at China, it's a very low rate of detention, but a very high rate of representation. So those kind of trends are interesting. We're watching some trends to try to figure out what's going on. And so why are only 14% of folks represented? Well, you're detained. And how do you find an attorney? All right? It's very, very difficult when you're in the detention center to find an attorney. We only are aware of people because their family members are calling, looking around. There's a group called AGUA, which is an accompaniment group. They're an amazing group of volunteers that go to the detention center to attend hearings, to talk to families in the waiting room. And oftentimes, they are the ones notifying us, hey, there's this case, can you all take it? Right? So it's not the individual sitting back in the detention area that is contacting us. Oftentimes, it's their families or someone from AGUA. If a detained individual doesn't have a family member who's advocating on their behalf, it's very difficult for them to find an attorney, right? And there's not enough attorneys doing immigration work, and there sure isn't enough of us doing detained work. There's reasons for that. Oh, there's so much to say about this, but just know that if you are doing detained work, that is all you can do. The hearings are very fast-paced. The filings are very fast-paced. You will go to the detention center and you might have to wait 4 or 5 hours to see your client because there are only just a few client consultation rooms. And remember, there's about 1,500 people there on any given day. You can't be doing anything else but detained work. So it's hard for folks that are private immigration attorneys, it's hard to make a living, right? So that's why we need more nonprofit organizations doing this work, more attorneys willing to do it pro bono, because otherwise it's very, very difficult to run a practice. So the other thing I wanted to say, so there's about 1,500 people detained at the detention center in Tacoma on any given day. And across the country, there's about 73,000 people detained on any given day. When Trump first came into his second administration, there were about 40,000 people detained on any given day. By the end of 2026, this year, he hopes to have 100,000 people detained on any given day, right? So 100,000 people detained on any given day. And that's just going to increase overcrowding, increase deaths. There's been, since the beginning of 2025, 47 people have died in detention, 30 in 2025, 17 already this year. The folks who have died because of the lack of medical care. There have been suicides. And there is even at least one reported homicide. The coroner ruled it a homicide. ICE said no, it was a suicide. What they're doing is they're fast-tracking expansion of detention so they can meet this arbitrary goal of 100,000 people on any given day across the country being detained. So they're turning warehouses into large detention centers that they hope to have thousands of people detained in these warehouses. We saw what happened in Florida with Alcatraz. We saw what happened in Texas with the tent cities, these very quickly fabricated detention centers that are not fit for human residents by any means. So as they ramp up the infrastructure, they're also ramping up the enforcement actions across the country. Prior to Trump, we had priorities for enforcement, so certain folks with criminal records, right, with serious criminal records, new arrivals, folks with old removal orders. There were priorities, and if you didn't fit within those priorities, you weren't detained. Well, one of the first things that Trump did in his administrations is he got rid of the priorities and he said everyone's a priority. So that has created such chaos. You have folks with pending applications with USCIS who are being detained. You have long-term residents, parents of U.S. citizens, spouses of U.S. citizens who have applications pending with USCIS that are being detained. They're just going after everyone and anyone. We have seen a number of our clients who were arrested based on the store they walked out of, Lowe's or Home Depot, the store they walked out of, the color of their skin, and maybe if the ICE officer heard an accent. And that was enough for them to detain them.
That just shows the expanse of, I guess you could say, at this point now, the lack of discretion. Yeah, as you said, it's an arbitrary number that when you try to force it into real life, we've seen gridlock, and not just gridlock in terms of capacity, but gridlock in terms of organizational design, where there were priorities and there were set, not channels you could say to go through, but purposes that were direct, and now there seems to be a lack of purpose behind all of this. I wanted to speak to the specific examples on your website here that are listed. Only 37% of all immigrants secured legal representation in the removal cases nationally. Could you speak to that?
So, there are two types of removal cases. Detained removal, and then you have non-detained dockets, so people who have received a notice to appear in immigration court. That statistic, I believe, reflects the percentage of folks who are represented in the non-detained docket. It's still very, very low. When I speak to the alternative to detention programs, 83% of individuals who were placed in alternatives to detention would show up to their removal hearings. 97% would show up if they were represented by an attorney. So if you want an efficient removal system, then an alternative to detention program is where we want to go. This is not about efficient removal. This is not about anything other than, in my opinion, two very large corporations making over $5 billion in 2025 alone to house individuals, the Core Civic Group and the GEO Group. These are the two private prison systems that contract with ICE. This is what's going on. I think you can always follow the money. They say that, right? And if you look at two corporations making over $5 billion off of terrorizing communities and housing folks in these ridiculous and oftentimes very, very dangerous detention centers, that's what we need to avoid and pull back from. So if you had an alternative to detention program that involves social workers, it involves access to services for U.S. citizen children if a parent is in a removal proceeding. It involves folks translating very complicated notices that come from the court. It involves transportation to your hearings, and it involves trying to pair an individual in removal proceedings with an immigration attorney. Those are very successful. Those cost $10 a day per person. When you have someone detained, that costs $150 to $200 per person.
That's a huge discrepancy. Thank you. Let's see. Are those the corporations involved in the Tacoma ICE Detention Center? Can you talk about the Northwest ICE Processing Center in Tacoma?
Yes. The Northwest ICE Processing Center in Tacoma came into existence in 2004, and it is a GEO group detention center. So the corporation GEO contracts with ICE to run that center. Its capacity, I think, is 1,562 beds, and they're at capacity and have been for a while. The state of Washington has attempted, I believe, 10 times, since 2023 to inspect the detention center because they've received over 3,500 complaints from detainees about the conditions, and they have been refused each time. The state continues to try, and that's happening across the country as well. You're having less internal inspection and refusal of external inspection of these sites.
So even if we were to try to reach those practically ridiculous levels of, 100,000 a day, there would not even be room to process them with everyone already there. And even during that processing, there's been requests to have that being evaluated. So that would just be sending them into a black box, essentially, where there isn't the ability to check on the process to even confirm that that process is being completed if that were to be implemented.
Oversight in any prison system is important. Again, Right about half the people detained have absolutely no criminal record whatsoever. So the folks that are detained are being lost. Oftentimes it's hard to find them. We have an ICE locator system that we can go on if we have their A numbers, their alien numbers, which are numbers that are assigned to each individual detained. And you can try to track where they are. That's very difficult. Right now, we have a woman who we believe is being deported today, but we can't confirm that she was deported. They moved her from Tacoma to Arizona, and at this point, her family just wants her deported, but we can't even confirm where she is right now, right? And the reason that's so important for the family is when she arrives in Guatemala, a family member has to travel 12 hours to meet her at an airport. They don't know when to start traveling, right? They don't know where she is. People disappear in this system. It's really hard to track.
You're sort of segueing into the next envelope to unopen, which is, you mentioned that you use these A numbers that are assigned when somebody is going into the prison system. And then you also rely on organizations like AGUA to be there and then send messages back to you. Are those the main ways that you work with the clients that are already held at the detention center, besides finding the A number and besides having communications with those types of groups like AGUA? Are those the main ways that you start the process from learning someone's in detention to getting them representation?
Yes, yeah. So through AGUA, through family members, once we have that information, then we go to the detention center, meet with the individual, and gather as much information that we can about their case so we can create a pathway forward. And sometimes there is no pathway forward. If someone has an old deportation order from 20 years ago and they re-entered and then later married a citizen and had children and created a life here, if they get picked up, it's very likely that old deportation order is going to be reinstated and they'll be removed without an opportunity to see a judge. So sometimes it is trying to help an individual get out of detention as quickly as possible, even if that means getting sent back to their home country. But that's what the individual has said they wanted, right?
Yeah, each case is their own. Sometimes they just know that they have something set up and ready to go. Sometimes because the alternative is being lost in the system where maybe you won't be able to be found by anyone.
Right.
I think an important part of all of this is obviously we want to provide an alternative to detention for people. Being out of detention means physically at home.
That's right, yeah.
And so it's about keeping people in their homes, even if there's this process happening, even if there's appeals that they have to do. Could you talk a bit about those alternatives to actual detention, the pathways that are available for people to not be detained?
So there's a very successful program in Chicago, a test program. Again, very, very successful. People showed up to their hearings. They were assigned social workers, and the social workers were then helping them assess social services for their families where necessary. That program can be replicated across the country, and it would be a very successful program. So let's talk about this gentleman. If he had been identified as someone who was in the country without proper permission, they could have been issued an NTA, a notice to appear for an immigration court, assigned to a particular community service organization to provide this kind of community-based alternative to detention service. And sometimes it involves ankle monitors, which I really despise. All of the folks who have been released from detention through our efforts, all but one, have ankle monitors. So they can't leave the jurisdiction of the state. This is how they know if they're going to show up for their hearings, that type of thing. I really despise that, but all of them have said they'd rather have an ankle monitor than be sitting at the detention center. So you would have a higher rate of compliance with the deportation hearing notices. They would have social workers working with the family in the event the individual was removed from the United States. They would make sure that the children had U.S. citizen passports so that they could visit their family member if deported. It's a much more humane system if you're working with service organizations, partnering with service organizations within this deportation context. So it is a viable alternative. Who doesn't win in this? GEO and Core Civic, right? These are the people who don't win in this situation. The Trump administration doesn't win in this situation because more people will be represented by immigration attorneys and will therefore avoid deportation.
This is your host, Michaela, bringing you the Resource Report, a deep dive into our community resources. We will return to our interview on LISO, the Legal Immigration Services of Olympia, after a word from our sponsors.
Support for KAOS is provided by the worker owners of Capital Home Cooperative. CHC is a caregiver-owned home care agency providing in-home care such as transportation, cleaning, assistance with hygiene, and more to seniors and people with disabilities in Thurston County. To learn more, visit capitalhomecare.coop or call 360-888-6175. Capital Home Care is a Chaos member discount business.
What up? This is the one and only DJ Cam. And right now you're tuned into KAOS 89.3 FM Olympia.
Welcome back to Resource Report on Chaos 89.3 FM, here with Lynne, Glore, and Steffani Powell on LISO, the Legal Immigration Services of Olympia. When you get an NTA, how does it come to you? Does it come to the mail? Do you get a phone call? Do you get an email? Does someone show up at your work? How does someone know that they've gotten an NTA?
There's various ways. So if an individual's detained, they'll receive an NTA while they're in detention, right?
Okay.
It'll say the reasons for being in removal proceedings. If an individual applies for an immigration benefit with USCIS and that benefit is denied, there is a growing movement for those denial notices to come with notices to appear for immigration court, either through the mail. And in the last few years, we have online systems where you can file certain things online. An immigrant community member could open an immigration account and see their notices on the account, so it might come that way through the mail. It should come to the attorney of record if the individual is represented with USCIS in their benefit request. If it's denied and a notice to appear is issued, it should also come to the attorney so that they can work with their client. I'm telling you, these notices to appear are not easy to understand, and so you have to find someone to translate it for you, right, and to help you understand exactly what this means. And it's a very complicated system to navigate along.
Have you encountered anybody that's seeking asylum, and have you ever encountered people that have been victims of human trafficking through this system?
So in the 10 months that we've been working with LISO, I've not encountered human trafficking yet, right? I know it's there. We are trying very hard to get people out of the detention center before their asylum hearings because the judges are denying asylum left and right. You don't want to have that hearing in detention. You really want to try to focus on the bond hearings and getting people out so that they can fight their removal outside. Yes, we have several asylum claims. If we can't get them out on bond, we'll have to fight the asylum.
Besides the pressure to meet the numbers and the pressure for the overload of cases, what reasons would you think that people are denying for asylum?
Everything is stacked against the immigrant right now. There's no doubt about that. So you have, I wish I could point to the policies, but we're aware that there are policies to encourage the Executive Office of Immigration Review judges to deny. We know there are policies to encourage the Department of Homeland Security trial attorneys to object to any approval. If a judge does approve a case, to object to it, to appeal it. I just had a case yesterday, and out in the hallway, the trial attorney looked at me kind of apologetically and said, if he grants this bond, I have to appeal it. And I just looked at him and kind of went like, we're attorneys here. You should have the right to say legally this is a sound case, this is a sound decision, but they are under a policy to appeal every approval that an immigration judge makes. So you have pressure for the judges to deny, you have the trial attorneys being told to appeal, and the individual's just stuck, right? They're just stuck. We need a new administration, and they need to untangle all of these horrific policies.
Where did that policy come from, and what is that policy?
Well, two policies came to mind this week. We have a case that has a pending application with USCIS, married to a U.S. citizen.
prior to this administration, the trial attorney would ask USCIS to expedite that foundational petition. And then the judge would have jurisdiction over the case to approve the permanent residence. Really, prior to just a couple of weeks ago, that was still happening. In our hearing last week, the judge said to the DHS attorney, okay, you're going to ask for an expedite from USCIS. It'll come, and then I'll adjudicate the application to adjust status. I can usually get that done within 30 days. And the trial attorney said, no, I'm not going to ask for expedite. And the judge spent 15 minutes arguing with the trial attorney about why he wasn't going to ask for expedite. And the judge said, is there a policy? And the trial attorney says, I don't know. And the judge said, tell me, is there a policy? And the trial attorney said, I don't know. Went back and forth that way. And finally, the judge says, are you going to ask for expedite? And the trial attorney says, no, I can't. And the judge, to quote him, he says, I'm not a potted plant. I deserve the right to know if there's a policy. And the DHS attorney would not tell him if there's a policy. So that means, even though this client has an opportunity to adjust status before the judge, we can't get the foundational petition approved in time. They're not going to let him just sit there. They're going to end up asking him to leave the country. And that's why we want the extern from Seattle University to go and sit in the courtroom weekly and look for trends, document policies, so that we can notify other attorneys what we see happening there on a weekly basis. That's one policy example.
Thank you for answering that. It sounds like there's trends that, as you said, would be very helpful to know to piece together for the system how to expect moving forward. When you're at work and you have your client, could you start from the beginning? What is the process that your client will go through in receiving your legal aid from step one?
Mm-hmm. Ideally, there's a family member who's contacted us, and we have extensive intake sheet. We are learning how to vet cases, and that's kind of hard to explain, and it's heartbreaking in the process. We have an extensive intake sheet that I then will look at and ask myself or another attorney to go to the detention center and do a more extensive consultation with that individual, right? And then oftentimes when we leave that first consultation, we're still not certain if we're going to represent them. There are so many factors. How many cases we're already representing? When is their next hearing? Can we attend that hearing if we're in another hearing room with someone else, right? If the individual says, I want out, I want voluntary departure, then of course we'll ask for voluntary departure, which we've had to do several times, or assisted or facilitated that conversation. If a family member is involved, then we will contact the family member after we've met with the individual, go over the plan. It's individual-centered. What do they want? So we try to give them the best information we can about what possibilities we see moving forward. And there was a hearing last week. Afterwards, I thought everything was understood. We knew what we were doing. And by the time I got back to Olympia, his wife called and said she'd spoken with him and he had this long list of questions. And I realized how important it is to take more time to sit and make sure what we think is the pathway forward is actually what the individual needs and wants. Because sometimes we're fighting really hard to keep them in the country when they would prefer to leave and try to consular process, for example, right? Because they don't want to be detained anymore. Depending on the individual, maybe staying in detention is absolutely not what they want to do and what they need. They might want to leave the country and, take the 3 or 4 year pathway to get back. We often have to put our legal minds aside, open our hearts and ears and eyes, and really listen to that individual about what they want. We do not ask about income, so if someone's unhoused, absolutely. If anyone who's detained at the detention center who needs assistance, we cannot take all the cases. We can only take so many cases at a time, or we're going to be inundated and not do our jobs well, right? And things will fall through the cracks. So we have the intake, we have the consultation, we come back, we have staff meetings, we try to figure out which cases can move forward and what we would do. Then we offer those plans to the individuals and try to figure out what they want to do within that context. I'll give you an example of a case now where we had an individual that we entered an appearance to represent, and we had a hearing coming up, and they moved him. They moved him to Texas first, and it took us a while to find him. We found him, and we were going to hold a bond hearing, and a bond hearing means an individual has the right to be released from detention if they pay a certain amount of money, which could be, $3,500, it can be $7,500, it can be $15,000, it can be $20,000. It's dependent upon the judge. But if they can pay that bond, then they're released from detention. They still have to fight the removal case, but they can do it from their home, right? And it's much easier to meet with your attorneys and gather your documents and fight your removal from your home setting and attend hearings in Seattle, for instance, at the immigration court for the non-detained docket. So this individual was moved to Texas. We were going to file a bond hearing request there, and they moved him again to Georgia, to a rural detention center in Folkston, Georgia, almost 3,000 miles away from home. This is the first time we had been faced with this, and I remember saying, well, our mission is to, represent people detained at the Tacoma Detention Center, but we can't just let them do this. Yeah. We can't let them rip them away, right? So we followed him. We found him in Georgia. We had a bond hearing. The judge was very receptive to our arguments. Nina did a fabulous job, and he was released from detention. But they released him around 10 p.m. at night in Georgia without an ID, without his phone, without any money, and only in the clothes that he had on when he was arrested in the Pacific Northwest on a warm day. And in Georgia that night, it was going to be 37 degrees. So you've heard a couple of stories of immigrants who've been released and who have died, right? They never made it back to their home. They died at a bus stop in the cold. When we heard that they were releasing him, and he had one last call to make to his U.S. citizen wife in the Pacific Northwest, saying, they're releasing me, what do? He doesn't even know where Georgia is. He doesn't understand how far away he is from his wife and child, and he didn't know which way to turn. He didn't know where to walk. He had no ID, nothing. We started calling around, trying to find someone who could pick him up at the detention center, and we ended up calling a hotel that was 5 miles away who agreed to take him in for the night without an ID, without any money, without, anything, if we could get him to the hotel. And it was my husband, Scott, who said, call the sheriff, see if the sheriff will pick him up. So we called the sheriff's office, spoke with a wonderful deputy who had actually spent time in the Pacific Northwest, whose daughter is here in nursing school, and he kept me on the phone as he drove the 5 miles out to the detention center. They brought the wrong guy out of the detention center and started to put him in the deputy's car, and I'm like, is this such and such? And they said no, and they had to take that poor guy back to the detention center. It's just very chaotic and a mess. So the deputy started driving around the perimeter, and he saw a man sitting on a curb. And he pulled up to him, and of course the client we knew would be terrified that he was getting ready to get arrested again for reasons unknown to him, right? So they kept me on the phone, and he says, I have your attorney on the phone. And I got on the phone with him and said, this is just your ride to the hotel, right? You're okay, you're safe. We'll talk in the morning. So they got him to the hotel. It took another week for him to get home because he didn't have any IDs. ICE had kept his ID and his phone and everything that he had on his body at the time he was arrested. He came across country on a Greyhound bus, but he got back. And he's now with his wife and his child and fighting his deportation in the court.
And this is all from going from you're about to have a hearing to suddenly learning like the day of or the week of, the day before that you have everything planned out, that they've been moved to a different state location twice, literally playing keep away right before you're about to go through the due process, holding their information and their personal effects for what seems to be no reason when they're already released. Like, why would you need to contain somebody's personal identification?
My guess on that case, and this is just a guess, is they moved him so quickly twice that they lost track of his belongings. That's my guess. But I have heard from other attorneys that they're seeing that happen more and more, where individuals are being released without their ID, their phone, their money that was on them. So it's a hard call to say why that happened. And why they're moving is they want their deportation numbers up. They don't want pesky attorneys interfering with this. That's what we're seeing. They're denying their rights. to individuals so that they can get their deportation numbers up.
You've been listening to the Resource Report on Chaos Radio. When we come back, we will finish our interview with Lynne Glore and Steffani Powell on LISO, the Legal Immigration Services of Olympia.
When you tune in to Spin the Globe on Fridays at 11 a.m., there are a few things you won't hear, like hypnotists.
We're now going to turn the pendulum into a sex detector.
Evil overlords.
You have failed me for the last time.
Or recipes for Swedish meatballs.
Bork.
What will you hear on Spin the Globe? That's easy. You'll hear this. And this. And this. Spin the Globe, Fridays at 11 a.m. Living locally and grooving globally since 1999. Only on KAOS 89.3 FM, Olympia.
Welcome back to Resource Report as we finish our interview with Lynne Glore and Steffani Powell, interviewing them about LISO, the Legal Immigration Services of Olympia. What are the misconceptions about your clients that the general public might have? Because there's a lot of language being thrown around, as you said earlier, about standards of community safety. No one wants to deny safety, but when people aren't safe themselves walking down the street?
Michaela, that's a great question. The way to talk about this sometimes is through telling the stories, right? So a case that comes to mind is a man with absolutely no criminal record who walked out of a Lowe's, who had some construction material that he purchased, who was profiled, arrested. And when they got him to the processing center, they forced him through fear and by interrogating him and then causing great fear that he'd not see his children for a long time to sign a stipulated order of removal, which was his own order of removal. They had him on a plane, shackled, and he again told them, I have 4 U.S. citizen children. So if we're talking about safety, what would happen to those 4 U.S. citizen children? Ages very young, like 3 or 4 to young teenagers. Who's looking out for the safety of those U.S. citizen children? And then another individual was profiled in Northern Oregon. He was working for a company that maintained sidewalks and parking lots. And again, they looked at him, saw the work he was doing, profiled him, arrested him, leaving 2 U.S. citizen children and a wife. He was the only income provider to that family. Another case, a man of 6 U.S. citizen children who he had worked in the farming industry for over 20 years. He had a crew of people that took care of fruit trees. The employer was very dependent upon him, training and managing the team of folks. So an employer lost a valuable employee. 6 U.S. citizen children lost the only income provider to their home. Who's looking out for the interests of that family who was very close to losing their home because they couldn't make the mortgage payments until their community stepped in? Who's looking out for those 4 U.S. citizen children who had just lost their mother from cancer 8 months previous, while their father was doing nothing but going to work? So whose safety are we talking about when we talk about terrorizing communities and ripping families apart? And having to, if that gentleman didn't have an attorney show up on his behalf and demand that they take him off that plane and give him an opportunity to see an immigration judge because he had been coerced into signing his own stipulation of removal order, what would happen to those 4 children? Who would have taken care of them?
So these people are profiled for working, essentially, for exiting a location where they're buying materials to perform labor. And it seems to be hard labor work. It seems to be physical labor work. So profiled for being not just working class, but working class in the middle of doing physical labor work. Is there some sort of misconception out there that people who do hard labor make your community unsafe, which seems to be backwards to me? It seems to be like those are the people that are an essential part of making things function. That disconnect and dichotomy between, we are going to follow people and detain people that are physically doing labor work seems to be against the whole American prospect of come to America, work hard, make your life, make your due.
Right.
I don't know.
Michaela? A misconception is that this population is taking jobs away from able-bodied, quote-unquote, Americans. I live out off of the Elm Highway, and there are some jobs out there in the fields, the strawberry fields, the blueberry fields, the raspberry fields, that are open to anybody who wants to apply. The only people that are working out there are immigrant neighbors and friends. So they are not taking jobs away from able-bodied Americans, even though you'll hear that rhetoric over and over. And the other misconception is that these people are the worst of the worst. And Steffani's already addressed that that's not the case, that most immigrants keep a pretty low profile and follow the law better than those of us that have lived here all our lives. Misconceptions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Lynne. Rhetoric is the word for it that I would use as well. It seems to be that there's loud, shouting, talking points trying to demonize people, and it doesn't seem like prosecution is what the goal here. It seems like the goal is meeting numbers at the expense of the safety of the people in our communities. We've talked a lot about the struggles. I wanted to ask you both about a positive example of a positive result that you have had following the course of someone going through these detention services, or being able to pull them out of this detention system, or even if it's just hearing from one of your clients that you've made a positive impact.
I will refer again to the case of the gentleman who was shackled and on the plane, because the night before they put him on the plane, I went to the detention center that night and sat with him and listened to his story, saw the love in his eyes for his children, the pain in his heart for the loss of his wife. And I said, I will fight as hard as I can for you. And he said, they're coming to get me tonight to deport me. I said, then I'll be here first thing in the morning fighting for you. And so I got up very early in the morning. It was a dark, rainy day. I'll never forget this. I called GO, and they said, he's gone. They've deported him. And I hung up the phone and just cried a bit, right? Because I told him I'd be there fighting for him. And I decided to get my old truck and drive up I-5 and go to the detention center and just see what I could do, if there was anything I could do, right? And the ICE office didn't open until 8 o'clock. I sat there and waited and waited. So finally, the person came out and said they're taking him off the plane. Probably the highlight of my career. 33 years, probably the highlight of my career. When I walked into the consultation room, he was sitting there and he had a smile on his face. And he said, I knew you'd be here fighting for me. And so he said he was on the plane, shackled, both his ankles and his arms. And he just kept waiting. And he kept waiting. Wow. He was waiting for either the plane to take off or to be taken off the plane. And when they took him off the plane, he understood what had happened, that someone had showed up and someone had given her best, not knowing what she was doing, to get him off that plane. That was really incredible. And I think he and I will be connected for the rest of our lives over that experience. We were able to get him out of detention. Not only did we get him off the plane, we were able to get him out of detention and back with his children. And he has his removal hearing next year. But he has a really strong case of cancellation of removal. He's been in the United States more than 10 years. He's worked all those 10 years, which is kind of interesting. Let's talk about that. Here you're punished for working. He was arrested for doing his job, going to work, getting his materials that he needed to do his job. And yet when he puts on his cancellation of removal case in front of an immigration judge in Seattle next year, he has to prove that he worked for 10 years, right? That he has filed his tax returns for 10 years, which he has.
That's a great success. Despite everything, despite them literally trying to play keep away from you, still holding on and showing up, you were able to get him back with his family. That's an incredible success. Earlier you mentioned Agua. What other organizations do you partner with or do you communicate with during this process?
So I'm a member of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, and there are individual private attorneys that I will ask for guidance on with these in some of the cases. And then there's the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, NIRP, an incredible organization that we partner with for federal filings right now. So judges at the detention center are refusing to issue bonds on behalf of people who previously would have been eligible to bond themselves out to go on the non-detained docket if they entered the country without permission, even if it's 20 years ago. And in the past, before just a couple of years ago, those folks qualified for bond. You would do the bond hearing, show that they're not a flight risk or a danger to the community. They would pay a bond, get out, and have their hearings. Well, now the judges are saying, regardless of when an individual entered the United States, they're not eligible for bond, even though federal courts have said, yes, they are eligible for bond. So when we have that situation, which our first few cases were all those cases, we can then send the case to the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project habeas team, and they are filing in federal court requests that the individuals be released because the judges are erroneous in their belief that their hands are tied. And so we've had a number of those cases get approved. So those have been some nail biters. When people contact LISO and they want to volunteer, we right now are sending them to AGWA because they have volunteer training. And they are plugging people into, do you want to work with families, make sure the children are getting to medical appointments, or they have food, diapers, so forth, and support the remaining parent, or if there isn't a remaining parent. We have a case right now of a 14-year-old that is in an AGWA volunteer's home. They're doing an amazing job. So you have folks that support the families, and then you have folks that go into the detention center and support the detained individuals.
That was going to be my next question is, when people want to volunteer for you, you would send them most likely to AGWA first, yes, unless they have actual legal expertise history or they're an attorney themselves. For people that want to volunteer their time or their donations, would you still send them directly to AGWA first for this?
People can help in a number of ways. We have encountered amazing support from this community, not just from AGWA. We do have some volunteers that have specific skills that they bring to us, like we're just in the process of hiring a volunteer bookkeeper for LISO, folks that have helped us with spreadsheets, maintenance, database maintenance. Donations are a big deal. We have our first annual fundraiser coming up in July 11th, which will be a big pan of paella cooked for 200 people, and it'll be on Urban Futures Farm. There'll be a raffle, music, just a great time.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
We are just the tip of the spear that's being thrown by our community. Our community has created LISO. There's no doubt about that. We would not exist if it wasn't for the community saying, no, we're not going to accept this. The need is so great, it's time to expand, right, so that we can help more people.
What is the best way for people to reach you? Is it through your website or?
We have a phone number that's on our webpage. We've got somebody that actually answers the phone.
Yeah, through email and telephone. Best way to get in touch with us.
We can be reached on our website, www.lisowa.org, all lowercase. Local phone number, 360-485-4488. We can also be reached by email at contact@lisowa.org.
Thank you so much. Is there anything else that you would like to share today?
I'm very, very interested in working with people for a long-term goal, as I mentioned earlier, of shutting down these detention centers and creating a more humane, protective system that honors the rights of individuals that are currently being trampled on.
Steffani and Lynne, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Michaela.
That's it for today's resource report, produced by Pathways to Agency. At Pathways to Agency, we are driven by the belief that everyone should have the tools and support to achieve their goals and thrive in their communities. Our mission is to bridge the gaps in understanding, accessibility, and trust by connecting individuals to resources and sharing information processes that can lead to personal and community growth. Resource Report offers information about existing and emerging nonprofits and resource organizations. Find out more at pathwaystoagencies.org. From there, you can follow the link to our podcast archive and listen to any episode anytime. And check out our YouTube channel. Chaos Radio is not responsible or liable for any views or opinions expressed in the interviews conducted by Resource Report. Till next time, and thanks